Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to our event today, Legacies and Aftermaths of the US War on Terror. My name is Abboud, and I'm a researcher with Security in Context and a co-convener along with Professor Lisa Hajjar of the Legacies of the Global War on Terror research track within Security in Context. Today's event is the first in a series of events taking place this fall and next spring that will explore the war on terror from multiple perspectives. These events are designed through a collaboration between Security in Context and the Orfalea Center for Global and International Studies at UC Santa Barbara. Please visit the Security in Context website at securityincontext.com for more information and to sign up to receive updates about upcoming events. Security in Context is a global network of scholars and researchers who aim to critically contribute to debates about US foreign policy and global security issues by foregrounding experiences of the Global South. Our transnational network brings together scholars from around the world to develop collaborative insight from the perspective of people and places often ignored, often ignored in debates about US foreign policy and global security issues. Our panel today features 4 guests whose contributions aim at reorienting our collective attention towards the many lives and legacies of the global war on terror that are often lost when we draw straight lines between 9/11 and the disastrous American-led interventions into Iraq and Afghanistan. Amidst our current moment of collective amnesia, in which the horrors of the war on terror are ignored in favor of narrow debates over whether the Biden administration should have militarily withdrawn from Afghanistan or not, it is more important than ever to shift attention to how the security logic of the last 2 decades produced patterns of surveillance, torture, and planetary warfare that will shape our world for decades to come. To engage in such work is not simply to remind people of what key moments define the war on terror that may have been lost or forgotten, but to inscribe this period with the true horrors wrought on people in the name of US security and the threat of terror. The cascading effects of these security logics would ultimately collapse the binaries of here and there, inside and outside, and render racialized populations, no matter where they existed, as threats. The justification and normalization of torture parallel deepening security practices against Arabs, Muslims, and those otherwise deemed as other and disposable. Borders became increasingly militarized. American military bases proliferated around the world. Drone warfare has become normalized despite years of evidence that its victims are overwhelmingly civilians. Aid practices became infused with the logic of security that would contribute more to global militarization than poverty alleviation. Confronting the threat of terror became the prism through which the world was to be slowly reordered. We are far removed from the moment in which American officials would make explicit statements to such effect, but we continue to live with the aftermath of their violent and delusional visions of the world. To help us understand these aftermaths, we have with us 4 guests today. I would encourage everyone to visit the Security in Context website for their full bios. I believe they're also going to be put into the chat in a minute. Speaking in the order in which they appear on the program, we'll begin with Professor Lisa Hajjar, Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, whose work focuses on issues relating to law and conflict, including military courts and occupations, torture, targeted killing, war crimes, and human rights. Lisa will be followed by Darryl, an anthropologist and attorney who works at the intersection of war, law, migration, empire, and race, with a focus on trans-regional linkages between the Middle East, South Asia, and the Balkans. Lee is the author of The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity. Next, we'll have Sinan Antoon, poet, translator, and scholar. Sinan was born and raised in Baghdad before leaving for the United States after the 1991 Gulf War. Among his many books and collections of poetry is The Corpse Washer, which my students will be reading in a few weeks. Finally, we'll hear from Deepa Kumar, an award-winning scholar and social justice activist. She is a professor of media studies at Rutgers University and has published, among other things, a widely read and translated book called Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn the Zoom room over to Lisa.
Thank you all. It's very nice to be with everyone. All I ever talk about or write about is torture. So of course that's the topic today. And the reason I sort of labeled what I was going to say, the war is not over, is because although the US torture program that was instituted during the Bush administration has come to an end, there has been no effort to sort of deal with this phase of history or come to terms. I just want to explain a bit why. So just very briefly, like how did the United States make torture the original strategic centerpiece for waging the war on terror? Several factors were at play. One, the war on terror began as a war for information because of the lack of intelligence about whoever had perpetrated the 9/11 attacks. But it was also decisions by the people in the executive branch of the Bush administration that, the law could be set aside in order to pursue national security, however the president deemed fit. And the idea that the people we were waging war against, who we didn't know who they were rightless enemies. And then, coupled with the notion that, people who did not have experience or knowledge about interrogation presumed and then drove policymaking that psychological and physical violence were essential to get the needed intelligence information. So as I said, capture, interrogation, and detention were the strategic cornerstone for the first 6 years. And torture was made permissible because people in the executive branch thought it was necessary. And then government lawyers, particularly those in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, reinterpreted the law to basically say whatever US security agents or military interrogators were doing would not fall afoul of the law. So how did torture end? I mean, that's a very long story, and it's the subject of the book that is, my next book, which is forthcoming. But it really came about as a result of two sets of phenomena. One was, sort of the exposures of the fact that the US government was engaging in torture by human rights activists and organizations and by investigative journalists. And so the slow trickling out of information about this deeply classified operation was important. But the other important factor was that lawyers got together and fought, US lawyers and their allies outside of law schools and the legal profession, fought the government over its prisoner policies. Not only torture, but also incommunicado detention, kidnapping, forced disappearance, and so on. And although these lawyers who fought the government in a number of different kinds of cases didn't win many, they won a few important cases, and that ultimately forced an end to the torture program itself. But why the torture has not come to an end, that we can say the war is not over, there has been no accountability whatsoever for people, officials, interrogators, and others who either authorized, abetted, or engaged in torture. And that, just to put this in context, torture is a crime, and it's not just a regular crime, it's a crime whose neighbors are genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And so, of course, the Bush administration wouldn't prosecute its own, people working for it. But when the Obama administration came to power in 2009, Obama took the decision not to pursue any kind of accountability on the argument that it was time for the country to, quote, look forward, not backward. A lack of accountability for a crime as egregious as torture means that there is no reckoning at how wrong it was, the fact that it was a crime, or anything to deter it in the future. But another way in which the torture legacy lives on is the fact that so many lies have been peddled about the effectiveness of interrogation tactics, or the fact that they weren't really illegal when done by US agents of the state, et cetera. And so those kind of lies have hidden what is right in front of us, which is a 20-year legacy of the war on terror. But there's also just an incredible amount of secrecy that is surrounding, the record of torture. And the most obvious example is the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence's detailed investigation into specifically into the CIA torture program, what they call the rendition, detention, interrogation program. That was completed in 2012. It sparked a huge fight because the Senate found that the CIA program was a total failure and had endangered US interests. Only in 2014, a heavily redacted executive summary was released, but that's it. The rest of that report remains classified and secret. And so therefore, we can't even know this important, tragic debacle in our history. And also the last point I would just say is that there have been no reforms that have been made to prevent these, a future president from exercising executive power and disregarding the law and regarding enemies of the state as rightless beings that would prevent this in the future. And we can just say that one of the reasons for that, we turn the mirror back on the United States. And the way in which I would understand this is domestic politics in the United States is thoroughly and in some almost bipartisan way reactionary. So, there is this sense that it's impossible to criticize US policy, including obviously egregious crimes and disasters, for what they are. And the idea that the torture of primarily Muslim men and boys was something that many people have applauded and would look forward to, bringing back. And so it is that kind of racism that imbues national politics in such an incredible way that it's not only impossible to turn the page, it's impossible to even see what is on the page, that the torture the US government authorized and interpreted the law, refused accountability, continues to haunt this country. And I think it's something that hopefully next generations of people will not, just think it's an irrelevant chapter of our history, but see it as absolutely central to understanding the United States in the 21st century.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was really wonderful. I'm sorry, in my excitement to get to the speakers, I forgot to mention that we can take Q&A. Please leave your questions or we can take questions, sorry. Please leave them in the Q&A box, and I will share them with the panelists when they're all done. Thank you again, Lisa. Next up, we have Darryl Lee.
Hi, thank you, Samir. Thanks to everyone who put this event together, and thanks to all of you who made time to log in and be with us today. I'd like to speak very briefly today around this concept of jihadism, which kind of stands in for so many of the ambiguities and ambivalences and violences of the war on terror, which has long been defined by an unwillingness to clearly define an enemy, right? So, this war on terror, like, what are we talking about, right? Terror is not, it's not a group, right? It's not a people. So this category of jihadi or jihadism, with an entire sort of like cottage industry of expertise that has grown up, has often kind of stood in for this idea of enmity. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time unpacking it today. And I thought I would do so with reference to a short video clip I'd like to show. So I apologize that the title of my presentation, is a very, very dated cultural reference, right? Will the real jihadi please stand up? But I can also stand by that because that song that it references is from 2000. And part of my contention is that a lot of the debates and the discourses around jihadism actually haven't advanced very far since 2000, including in their critical variants. So if you'll bear with me on the technology, I'm just going to try to get the video set up. And I'm also going to turn my camera off as well to minimize distraction. So just one second. Okay, so can folks see this? Yeah, so the context is, this is General Joseph Neller. He is the former commandant of the US Marine Corps, and he's speaking here at a press conference at the Pentagon in 2018 about the situation in Afghanistan.
We're hopeful that, we can support the Afghan military and the governor in Helmand and the local police and the national police, and that we can create a secure environment so that the Afghans can have an election, and that possibly there'll be a significant enough program so that those Taliban who think there might be a better way to live their lives than continue to have their young men get killed, being led by people that aren't even there in the fight, that live in other countries, and that are convincing them that this is the right thing to do when really all they're doing is making money on drugs. I mean, we talk about, the terrorists call themselves, they're the freedom fighters, they're the mujahideen. They're not. They're criminals. I think the Arabic word is takfiri. They're apostates. They hide behind Islam. They sell drugs. They kill innocent people. That's not what Islam is. The Afghan army and the American, we're the mujahideen. We're the mujahideen. That's the message. And maybe they'll get tired of this and they'll decide that there's a better way, and then we can move on to something else.
Thank you. Tower Cop Military Time.
Okay, so needless to say, that interesting clip elicited its fair share of online derision. So I've also shared, a small sample of some of the tweets that came up in response to this. And I think this is actually a really interesting clip. And actually, it's peak war on terror liberalism. So just a couple of thoughts about what I don't think is going on, right? So there's two very common, sort of talking points that circulate in a lot of sort of conversations that I'm in, people who are critical of the war on terror. And I don't think they necessarily help us understand what's going on here, right? So one of the common forms of pushback on, war on terror discourse is what I call the, not all Muslims response, right? So there are just, many, many varieties of challenges to anti-Muslim and racist discourses that really emphasize the sheer plurality and diversity among the billion-plus Muslims worldwide, and basically saying that, groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so on, don't represent Islam or Muslims in any meaningful way. And the other form of critical response is what is sort of the complicity response, right? So this kind of is the line that says, well, the United States originally armed and trained and equipped, jihadist group X or Y, right? So actually, the responsibility sort of goes all the way back to them. I want to emphasize that both of these lines of argumentation are entirely correct and necessary, and I think they're compelling for very good reason. But by themselves, they're not really a substitute for sort of concrete political analysis of what these groups are up to. And they themselves, and without that concrete analysis, they can also be kind of co-opted in sort of imperialist discourses, right? So the not all Muslims discourse, war on terror liberals are actually very accustomed to that form of pushback. And the most common response is to present the United States and its imperial power as the ultimate guarantor or protector of Muslim pluralism, right? So the line is basically, yeah, we know not all Muslims are alike, and the United States needs to invade this country or kill these people precisely to protect the good Muslims from the bad Muslims. The issue with the complicity discourse is that, again, I think it's absolutely correct, but when it moves from a broad assertion of political responsibility to some of the more concrete claims around causality, like the US trained bin Laden and so on, it also opens the door to a pro-war argument, which is basically that, if the United States created all of these entities in the first place, it actually has additional responsibility to sort of take them out, right? So, most infamously, Christopher Hitchens, when he was cheerleading for the invasion and the war of aggression on Iraq, actually would often say this. People would say, well, the United States used to be allies with Saddam Hussein, and he would say, yeah, well, therefore we actually have all the more reason to sort of go and invade the country, which of course is a pretty perverse, in my opinion, take on these arguments. So I don't think, those critiques are valuable as far as they go. I don't think they necessarily help us get at what's particularly strange about this clip of this U.S. general saying, we are the real, the real mujahideen, I think is what he said, right? So what I think is really at stake in this jihadism discourse is actually something slightly different, right? So I want to make a distinction here. Among Muslims and among believers, there, of course, always have been and always will be very rich and intense debates about what counts as jihad, what doesn't count as jihad, how jihad should be conducted or not. There are folks who, and some of these debates are very much grounded in discourses of jurisprudence or fiqh. Some are less so. Some, of course, are going to emphasize, forms of armed action. Others are going to emphasize, spiritual struggle, so on and so forth. As I said, those debates are always going to be there. What happens, though, with the jihadism discourse, right, when you instead of just saying, okay, there's forms of action in the world that people call jihad or don't call jihad, jihadism as a category, as an object of knowledge, as a thing that you start endowing chairs and building research programs and giving grants and organizing conferences around, that's an entirely different exercise. And the issue here, I think, is that the label of jihadism takes some subset of all the different things that people, and by people I mean Muslims, are debating as jihad. It takes one particular subset, however it might be defined, and then kind of elevates that into a general category or an object of knowledge without necessarily having clear or justifiable criteria for doing so, and represents essentially an intervention into a dispute among believers with their criteria with a kind of faux objective or social science approach of, okay, well, these things count as jihadism, right? So there are a couple of problems that arise from this. One, of course, the obvious one is that the kinds of jihad that attract the most notoriety from, the security state, from Western audiences, from people in general, are groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on, that of course are often the most contentious and controversial, both within theological debates and among sort of, Muslim populations worldwide, right? So you've already built a category around the very examples that are, whose very inclusion in that category are super, super controversial from the point of view of many of the people involved. There's another problem, which is more of a conceptual one, which is if you decide that some forms of jihad are jihadism, then there's a corollary, which is what about everything that is also called jihad that falls out of that category, right? So when you start talking about jihadism, you create a residual category of essentially non-jihadist jihads, right? So if you look at some of the terrorism expert literature, they'll say things like, oh, jihadis are people who, I don't know, reject the state system or something like that. But then you have, bazillion examples and a very rich history of states and non-state actors and people doing other things and calling it jihad, right? Including engaging in violence, right? So your standard categories of jihadism, would not include, for example, the Iran-Iraq war and the way that both sides at different times might have mobilized the language of jihad, right? You're not including, say, the Ottoman Empire declaring jihad during World War I. You're not even including, a lot of groups that, call themselves like jihadis, right? So what's particularly interesting about this clip that we were looking at, the Neller clip, is that, he, at first blush, it seems weird because normally, the mainstream expectation is, oh, the Taliban are jihadis. I'm being asked to restart my video. Okay, sorry about that. The Taliban are the jihadis, and the Afghan government and Americans are fighting jihadis. Now, what's weird about this is that the regime that the Taliban recently displaced called itself the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and also situated itself within traditions and discourses denominated as Islamic, right? And the Taliban calls itself the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So what Neller is essentially doing is saying, is arbitrating on this idea of who gets to be considered the Islamic actor here, right? And he's actually saying it's the Afghan government, it's not the Taliban, without any clear criteria for doing so, because I'm pretty sure he's not speaking as someone who situates himself within the tradition, right? He's essentially arbitrating on this dispute over who gets to be called Islamic, without, I think, a particularly good basis for doing so. And he's not even saying that that's what it is, what he's doing, right? So as Talal Asad and many others have told us, secularism often operates through this way of setting up and policing a kind of boundary between the religious and the secular as these distinct domains. So if the United States has the right to decide, who is a jihadi and who is just a person who does jihad, then it's actually not. It's just the next logical step that they can step in and claim this mantle for themselves, right? So he's saying the Afghan government, they're the real mujahideen, and we, the United States, we're aligned with them, so we're the real mujahideen as well. So there is a kind of perverse logic at work in this kind of chain of significations, and that's also, I think, part of the broader logic of universalism, right? So it's not just that the U.S. goes around the world talking in universal values and violating them. Of course, it does that. But part of the power of what it means to have an effective universalist project is you can declare certain people as the enemy, you can cast certain people outside of mankind, which everyone kind of does, but you also make that decision on behalf of other people. Right. So you actually set expectations and set standards that others also start to emulate. Right. And that's when you can start going around declaring, who's a real jihadi, quote unquote, and who's not. And I think that's also a particularly perverse aspect of this, which is also why I don't actually think a sort of general theory of jihad as a social practice is possible as something that's coherent if you are outside of one of these traditions of dispute. So that's basically why I think the category of jihadism is garbage, and why I wrote a book which is about jihad but actually rejects jihadism as a paradigm or as a model for thinking.
Thank you so much, Darryl. Next, we have Sinan. And a reminder to the audience to please leave any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samer, Omar, and Lisa. I'm delighted to be here also with Darryl and Deepa. I'm happy that Samer mentioned amnesia, because I think the level of amnesia, particularly when it has in relation to Afghanistan and Iraq, is really staggering. A colleague of mine was telling me that he asked his students, first year of college, and they knew nothing about Iraq, which forces me oftentimes to restate the basic facts, unfortunately. So, being a poet also, I will do something very unusual and blasphemous in something with the word security in it, which is I will read part of a poem, not mine. Whenever we approach the 9/11 anniversary, I return to a poem entitled A Conversation with a Painter in New York After the Towers Fell, written by the Iraqi poet Sargon Bolus, who died in 2007, who had lived in the United States since 1968, and who knew the politics of empire very well. The excerpt from the poem goes like this. I see Rodin's fingers in all this. I see him standing at the gates of hell, pointing to an abyss from which the beasts of the future will charge. There, where two towers fell and America went mad. And I find this poem prophetic on so many levels. Now, neither the Iraqi regime nor any Iraqi individuals had any role in the 9/11 attacks. Sadly, I have to say this, but there's a significant number of fellow citizens who still think that Saddam Hussein is involved in the 9/11 attacks, which says something, of course, about the corporate media. Nevertheless, Iraq and Iraqis were added to the list of targets because there weren't enough targets in Afghanistan, as Rumsfeld said. The initial claim was the possession of weapons of mass destruction, which many of us knew were non-existent to start with. A country that had suffered the destruction brought on Iraq by the US bombing campaign of 1991 and the ensuing sanctions would not be capable of manufacturing such weapons. But it did not matter at all. Later, the narrative would, of course, shift into so-called nation building or the supposed export of democracy into a region where all kinds of undemocracies are supported by the US. But what took place was not nation building, but nation destruction. By 2003, Iraqis had already suffered a great deal because of the horrors of dictatorship, but their suffering had been compounded and perpetuated unnecessarily by the genocidal sanctions imposed on Iraq in 1990. These sanctions were maintained until 2003. The sanctions did not damage the regime and the ruling class as much. The latter exploited them to further their interest and find alternatives to maintain their power and hold on the country. The sanctions did, however, degrade every aspect of life for most Iraqis, depleting resources and destroying an already frayed social fabric, causing the death of hundreds of thousands of civilians. But that price was worth it, as Madeleine Albright said infamously on 60 Minutes. These sanctions, to my mind, were a form of remote control terrorism. I mention this to underscore then the barbarism of the 2003 invasion and its aftermath, to attack this society yet again. Now, while most Iraqis desired to be free of dictatorship, they could do without and never signed up for the dismantling and destruction of state institutions and structures that took a century to build, and replacing them with failing institutions, as I will try to show, let alone the unleashing of unprecedented violence and terror. The deaths, smoke, suffering, body remains, rubble, and horror visited on New York on 9/11 was multiplied and magnified and inflicted on Iraqis and Afghanis in a protracted frenzy of imperial madness, delusion, and avarice, infused with good old-fashioned Hollywoodish cowboy vengeance against Indians. But the blood and the corpses are real. In the first few weeks of the war, one of the US soldiers accompanying an embedded reporter for a TV network said, as the convoy was leaving Al-Taji camp in Baghdad, quote, "This is Indian country," end of quote. A few years later, Brian Williams quoted a general repeating the same phrase as they flew over Iraq. "This is Indian territory." While not officially in military books, it seems that this term is quite common, refers to unsecured, hostile, enemy territory. Which brings us to the issue of how important and integral it is to look back at the archive of settler colonialism in this country, because it's intimately linked to what this country does abroad. And in terms of the cowboyish rhetoric, I should mention, and I hate to mention his name, but I have to, about what Thomas Friedman said on the Charlie Rose show. He just said simply, we hit Iraq because we could. And he said, boys and girls going house to house from Basra to Baghdad, telling people, suck on this. This is the level of discourse about that barbaric war. Now, the war on terror in its Iraqi chapter created the conditions to create, attract, and incubate terrorism in Iraq. It is worth remembering that before 2003, terrorist attacks in Iraq could be counted on one's fingers. It is also important to remember that they were carried out by Al-Da'wa party members, a party which would later be part of the new Iraq and the political process, would actually occupy a central role. US policies in Iraq themselves created the conditions that would create and spread terrorism. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before 2003. And Paul Bremer's policies in terms of dissolving the Iraqi army, dissolving all of these state institutions, pushing tens of thousands of people in the security apparatus into unemployment, shutting down so many factories, all of this led, and then not replacing any of these institutions with durable functioning institutions, led to the spread of terrorism in Iraq. Also, Bush himself said, basically, let's fight them there so we don't have to fight them here. So basically making Iraq a magnet for global terror, whereby Iraqis would pay the price. The horror of dictatorship was replaced with the terror of the United States. And this condition, this climate in a way, led to the rise of ISIS. There is credible research that shows how US prisons in Iraq were actually the sites where ISIS organized and recruited and mobilized. There is so much to say about what the kind of destruction and horror that was visited on Iraqi civilians, which they live with still until today. There is Fallujah, of course, the case of Fallujah and the destruction of that city, but also the use of white phosphorus. Until today, babies there are born with congenital defects because of the weapons that were used by the United States. There are so many other massacres in Haditha and elsewhere. And then there is, of course, the notorious case of Abu Ghraib, which to my mind is a microcosm in a way of the Iraq war. Here is this prison where Iraqis were subjected to all kinds of horror and torture that was administered by Saddam's henchmen, but later it was administered by the agents of empire. And then there's all the Blackwater crimes. On 9/11, civilian airplanes were hijacked and weaponized by terrorists to kill thousands of innocent civilians. That site and that moment and its meaning and memory was hijacked and weaponized by empire to kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians. The perpetrator of this imperial terror were and are in uniform, using military hardware and sophisticated technology and drones to outsource terrorism. The harrowing scenes of the two airplanes flying into the towers are engraved, of course, into our global collective memory as some of, if not the most iconic scenes in recent history. However, thousands of structures, buildings, homes, rooms, and bodies were destroyed in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere in imperial madness, but there are no memorial sites with fountains for them, nor do we know their full names and numbers. They are ghosts hovering, and their killers and the architects of these wars were never held accountable. Moreover, it is really quite disturbing how all of this is basically reduced to the blunder discourse. Oh, it was a blunder. Oh, it was a mistake. So going back to the poem I started with, the question is, of course, the urgency of stopping the beasts of the present and the future from creating more hells on this earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sinan. And finally, we have Deepa Kumar with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this panel. My topic is anti-Muslim racism, and that's of course, the focus of my book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire. The second edition actually really tries to focus and flesh out how Muslims were created as racialized subjects. And it starts with the early modern era in Spain and goes up to the present, which is the Trump presidency. But what I want to start with before, diving in a little more into anti-Muslim racism is something that other panelists have also mentioned, which is that the war on terror is not over, right? There is an assumption in some quarters that after the US withdrew from Afghanistan, that the war on terror has now come to an end. And people have argued quite, well that that is not the case. And I'll just add this to what has already been said, which is that the infrastructure of the war on terror is not going to be dismantled anytime soon. What is clear is that large-scale military interventions and occupations are over, right? These were disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were defeats for the US, not to mention, the horrific human toll that has been paid by Iraqis and Afghans. But there are certainly sections of the political elite that have come to the conclusion that this approach should be shelved, right? So whereas the US used this approach quite successfully after World War II in Japan and Germany to remake these countries in its own image, right, is to remake these countries so that they fit in with the US geopolitical vision and global imperial dominance. that strategy is something that, at least for the time being, is going to be shelved. However, the war on terror is going to continue in other ways, the war of terror, I should say, which is that the US has expanded its bases, and depending on who you look at, to either 800 or 1,000 bases around the world, right? And some of these bases are tiny, but a number of them, some key strategic ones at least, are the places from which drone strikes are carried out. And Biden has pretty much come out and said that drone warfare and the use of special operations forces is the way in which they're going to continue to operate in various parts of the world. We also know from the Cost of War project that the US was involved in counterterrorism operations in 85 countries around the world between 2018 and 2020. And counterterrorism can mean anything from training local police and military forces to actual attacks. And so, that infrastructure is not going to be demobilized anytime soon, and it's going to continue to give the US the means by which to exercise its power and hegemony on the global scale. Now, of course, there's been an attempt to shift Obama's famous Pivot to Asia document back in the mid-2010s, because, whereas this used to be a sort of minority opinion, which is that the Chinese are a key threat to the United States. This was part of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, where he identified 7 or 8 civilizations, of which the key enemies to the US were the Chinese and the Islamic civilization. But it bears repeating that this was a minority view in the 1990s. The Clash of Civilizations was not taken up by the Bush Senior or by the Clinton administrations. In fact, Cheney and Rumsfeld had put out a report calling for the use of overwhelming US military force to reshape the world and to take preemptive action so that no rival could ever rise to power. And at the time, this was a secret document. At the time, it got leaked, and Rumsfeld thought his career was over. He had to just wait till 9/11 when this became a bipartisan consensus. So at any rate, there's a pivot. There is a bipartisan consensus around Pax Americana that begins in 2001. And as has been said by others, this was the basis from which the US could weaponize its, the tragedy in order to pursue imperial goals. But there's been a shift to a focus on China as well, at least since the mid-2010s. And certainly, Trump has, people have probably seen these videos, right, of Trump saying, China, China, China. And it's not a coincidence that he called the coronavirus and COVID the Chinese flu, the Asian flu, and so forth. And it's not as if Biden has, let that go. Biden, too, has taken quite an aggressive posture towards China. So all this is to say that counterterrorism, even while the rhetoric and the focus is now multi-pronged, and it's not just the war on terror, counterterrorism remains too important and too central to US imperialism for the infrastructure of imperial control to be dismantled. Now, ideologically, what props this up, of course, is the figure of the racialized terrorist threat. Darryl spoke about the jihadist, and of course, this is where anti-Muslim racism comes in. And what I argue is that anti-Muslim racism is, of course, an ideology. It is, the ways in which the war in Iraq, let's bring democracy to these benighted masses, let's liberate Afghan women, right? It's an ideology that furnishes the grounds for US intervention in large parts of the world, but it's also a set of practices that remain important. And Lisa talked, of course, about torture. And there's a racialized logic to this torture, as she pointed out. And if you look at a book like what's his name, Raphael Patai's, what's the name of the book? The Arab Mind, right? Which was the basis from which some of the torture was orchestrated in Abu Ghraib. That gives you a sense of how this racialized subject becomes the basis of these methods of control. At any rate. I want to focus a little bit on the domestic context as well. So counterterrorism practices like intrusive surveillance, visa checking, interviews, detention, deportation, and so on. Some of these practices long predate 9/11, but these practices, along with new ones, were amplified after 9/11, and the racial Muslim was constructed as a security threat against whom a series of security practices were designed. So the FBI's infamous entrapment program that Trevor Aronson, the investigative journalist, has written about quite well, is based on sending, the over 15,000 informants that the FBI has into Muslim communities to entrap vulnerable people into doing things that they otherwise would not do. And the logic, of course, is we know these people are predisposed to terrorism. We know they are potential terrorists, so let's nab them, right? Obama's Countering Violent Extremism is about recruiting coaches and teachers and imams and community leaders to similarly survey what is considered and coded as a security threat population, right? A suspect population. So if we had preemptive wars on the international front, we have preemptive prosecution on the domestic front, which is again based on this idea that Muslims are a suspect community. This notion of a monolithic racial Muslim is what animates much of this practice. And so what I argue is that it's inadequate to understand Islamophobia simply as hate crimes, hate speech, microaggressions, workplace discrimination, religious intolerance, or attacks by far right-wing groups and their desecration of mosques and community centers. All this is true, but they're all manifestations of anti-Muslim racism, not the key force that actually drives it, right? I think an analogy might be helpful, which is that these things are the tip of an iceberg. What lies beneath is a security establishment that has created a racial Muslim threat in order to reproduce and sustain empire. And there's a long history to it, which I go through in the book to much greater length. But suffice it to say, and I'll start to wrap up with this, is that what begins as a security practice that targets one group typically does not stay with that group, but actually is used to target others as well. And this happens both domestically and internationally, right? So surveillance practices developed in Iraq come back to be used in New York City and vice versa. Security practices developed in the US go abroad and so forth. But for us in the US, the legacy, one of the legacies, if you will, of the war on terror is that mechanisms of racial and social control developed after 2001 and even before that have been directed at other threats to empire. So for instance, Native Americans were targeted using counterterrorism practices when they protested the Keystone Pipeline, right? White anti-war activists were targeted for supposed material support to terrorism, these provisions that were originally designed and used against Muslims. And surveillance technology, right? The ubiquitous cameras everywhere. We know from the reporting that's been done that the movement for Black lives and protesters, for instance, recently who have come out for rallies for justice for George Floyd, have been, targeted by these surveillance methods. And this is not surprising. There are these things known as fusion centers that bring together local police with, the FBI and so forth. And if you look at some of their documents, they don't just go after the jihadists, the Muslim terrorists, and so on. They've expanded it to include, people who they think of as threats, environmental rights activists, BLM protests, and so on. So at the end of the day, the war on terror in the form of active war, boots on the ground, and so on, that aspect may be over, but what's expanded is that all of the systems devised to target Muslims have now been, expanded to every threat to the imperial order, both at home as well as abroad.
Thank you so much, Deepa. That was really wonderful. Thank you to all of the panelists. We have 4 questions in the chat box now. I'd like to encourage anyone up 5 now. I'd like to encourage everyone to leave your questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to exercise what little power I have as a moderator and go sort of out of order and direct the first 2 questions to Lisa, if that's okay, from Leila. Why has American exceptionalism been so enduring in the minds of Americans? Has Trump's presidency and the following political polarization further grounded this exceptionalism? Lisa, if you could answer, and I'd invite the other panelists to join in if they'd like as well.
Sure. Well, thanks. Those are the kinds of questions that I've been pondering, as long as I've been a sentient adult. So the issue of American exceptionalism, I think that all of the talks today sort of refract that, durability of this perception among Americans that this country is exceptional. And both it makes it impossible to really look with accuracy at our own history, our own past, or to assess things in ways that would be, as one could say in the most idealistic terms, in keeping with our, our national ideals, our national values. So there was a book, one of the torture lawyers that has been crucial in fighting the government. He was one of the first guys out of the gate. Is a guy named Joe Margulies, who's both a lawyer and a professor at Cornell University. And he wrote a book that I teach to my many hundreds of students. The book has a terrible title. But it's a great book. It's called "What Changed When Everything Changed." So it's about the post 9/11. But he's really looking at this question of the national creed. And what he and many, many other scholars have documented is that this country is baked into its DNA, the perception that, America can do no wrong, that this is a country unlike any other, that its greatness is innate. And then the question is, how does that thing pass from generation to generation, century to century, despite the fact that there have been these horrific chapters of, unmitigated disaster that we can now in the present look to the past: genocide, slavery, the internment of Japanese Americans. And so Margulies refers to that sort of as the dark side of the creed, and notes that part of what happens is that the way in which this national identity and national rhetoric works in the United States is it's imbued with a kind of teleology, like even the bad things, like that was then, but thank goodness it's not like that anymore. This teleological notion that we may not always be perfect, but we're better than anybody else, and we keep getting better than we used to be, kind of a thing. And so because of that, there is just, it's extraordinary. It becomes almost regarded as traitorous to hold a harsh light up to, sort of the dark side as it's actually unfolding, like the war on terror and all the dimensions that Sinan and Deepa and Darryl have talked about. But just to give one example of that is, when Guantanamo, which is still open, almost 20 years since the first detainees arrived there. But even as the kind of debacle, the disaster that Guantanamo was started to be perceived as such, even in the Bush administration. Whenever anybody who was like picked up, sold for bounty or whatever, who ended up in Guantanamo is released, it's not with an apology or like, oh my God, we made a terrible mistake. They are no longer enemy combatants. So that's just one illustration of the institutional inability to look critically at these things. And so then just the question on Trump, whether or not things have changed under Trump. One can say that Trump is a product of sort of what I've been talking about, but more broadly, Trumpism. And Darryl, I hope you don't mind if I use an ism here, because I think this one fits. The Trumpism of the kinds of people who the really reactionary, racist thing. Trump, was elected on a campaign to bring back the water board, to bring back torture. And, one can see now it's, he's out of office, but, the kind of command he's taken over the Republican Party illuminates the fact that for a large sector of the American public, and one that's perhaps gotten larger since the start of the war on terror, is this, complete disdain for the concept of human dignity or human equality. I mean, human dignity is regarded as like some liberal fiction. And so when you get that defining politics, it is not only impossible to take stock of the errors we made or to look critically at, to do things, but that this is a kind of, empowered dangerousness fueled by, if it's the Trumpists' ignorance, or if it's the kind of neocons, and somebody else had asked about that, waiting for another opportunity to once again bring that kind of neocon agenda to the next war that we're going to fight, because we haven't understood that we just lost the last war.
Can I make a small point about exceptionalism? Thank you, Lisa, for that comprehensive answer. I'll just say that exceptionalism is not the province just of the right or of Republicans, but it is a bipartisan project in American politics. And
absolutely,
in terms, no, I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm saying that in response to has Trump's presidency, furthered exceptionalism? And I think yes and no is the answer to that question. On the one hand, there is a kind of, white nationalism that Trump embodied that exceptionalizes the US in a particular kind of way, but he walked away from the other kind of exceptionalism, which is that the US is a beacon of freedom and democracy in the rest of the world, and that's why it's got to intervene on the global stage, right? So he went hard after ending the forever wars and shifting towards a focus on China and so forth. So, we should complicate this notion that it's not just the right and Trump and so on who appropriate exceptionalism, but that liberals, the liberal establishment, liberal interventionists also very much use this to further empire. It's just that the rhetoric looks slightly different.
Thank you so much, Deepa, for that intervention. With Darryl, Sinan, you'll have an opportunity to respond later if you'd like, but if you want to jump in now, no, we're good. Okay. Darryl, let's go to the first question that was directed to you. This is from an anonymous attendee. US state officials can make all kinds of universalist claims, and they can attempt to arbitrate the question of who good Muslims are, etc. And Americans can believe it. However, there's practically no one in Afghanistan or Iraq or Pakistan or Iran, i.e. the Muslim world, who believes the US has any authority to speak about Islam, make universal claims, etc. So the question is, when US state officials make these claims, is the audience the world or just domestic constituencies in the West?
Thanks, that's a great question. The thing with belief is that, of course, it's just very thorny, right? Like, I don't want to presume to get inside what's going on in people's heads. I think I agree with the premise of the question that, when the United States talks about human rights, most of the world scoffs. But I think that, and rightfully so, but it's, the point that I was making in my presentation, I mean, it wasn't really a point. It was just what I meant to convey is that, it's not really just about the beliefs. It's about how discourse operates within a set of material conditions. So the United States might talk about human rights, and people who don't believe anything about US rhetoric, nevertheless, oftentimes feel compelled to use languages and forms of rhetoric that they themselves don't accept in order to make political claims, in order to be heard, right? So like the US, comes with an entire, panoply of, NGOs, human rights discourses, and then this leads to jobs, this leads to access to resources, this leads to so many things. So it creates a situation where a significant number of people, including in the countries that the question references, do end up using this language, whether they believe it or not is kind of a separate issue, but that the fact that they have to does have material consequences, right? So, I wish, it would be much easier and, to be able to say, well, this is just rhetoric. and and then there's this hard violence on the other hand. But the whole hard power, soft power distinction, to me, is just it doesn't make a ton of sense. Yes, you can, no matter how brutal and fascistic any kind of state violence is, there is always going to be an ideology of justification that accompanies it. And yes, the extent to which certain audiences need to buy in or not is going to vary. So I think, in a way, the question kind of answers itself by saying, there's the inner circle, right, is like the American audiences whose consent, if you will, for these things is maybe a little bit more important than, say, what folks in Afghanistan might be thinking. But even the US citizenry doesn't really believe in a lot of this stuff, right? So some of the things that Lisa and Deepa were talking about how the war on terror has evolved, especially during the Trump era, speak to the fact that the partnership between the sort of technocratic liberal security state and the sort of like and a more populist form of white supremacy, that the tensions have actually grown in recent years. And I think that helps to explain some of these shifts that have been going on, which is not to say that, that the United States or the war on terror is any less imperialist or less white supremacist than before, but rather that there are important shifts and realignments, both within the elites and among kind of popular forces that have to be accounted for. So I think it's, that's why you can see someone like Trump, on the one hand, tapping into popular exhaustion with large-scale ground engagements in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, but at the same time, amp up, anti-Muslim racism and sentiment through things like the Muslim ban, right? Like, I don't think it's that, these publics became any less anti-Muslim. Rather, it's that racial antagonism, especially against Black people, has become so much more open a form of mainstream politics inside the United States that there's just a different set of targets, right? And I think that speaks to a radically different set of possibilities and coordinates for political struggle that both the state-based and the extra state wings of white supremacist movements in this country are actively working on. So in a way, like the long war in Afghanistan at this point, it's just not as important, right? I mean, it becomes almost an afterthought. Of course, they're going to instrumentalize it, against Biden. Of course, the refugees who come are going to become targets of white supremacist violence. I think that's something we all have to be prepared for. And I also think, given the history of anti-communist diasporas in the United States, some of those folks are also going to feel compelled to actually align with white supremacy as a way to protect themselves, which I think is another important area for folks to be thinking about in organizing around the refugee issue. Because I'm actually a bit concerned about how the line about welcoming the Afghan refugees, and specifically those who collaborated with the US military, has become kind of this lowest common denominator politics for certain segments of the right and liberals and the left in the United States. I think it's very important to sort of support the humanitarian aspect of that, but also to have a concrete political analysis for what's going on and how this particular program is feeding into different kinds of political agendas.
Thank you, Darryl. The next question is for Sinan. I fear the US will continue doing what it does until it somehow self-destructs or implodes or is defeated by some revisionary power or powers, essentially because notions of exceptionalism and American superiority are part of the US DNA. Do you think a better world is possible with US having the kind of power it does?
I'm a pessimist usually, and that's a very difficult question, but I should say that for the first time in a very long time, at least we have some radical critical voices in Congress that hold the US and its foreign policy accountable, and there is a somewhat of a generational shift. So of course, change has to come from within. And I mean, by mentioning the Indian territory and all of that, I was trying to gesture into how all of this is interconnected. So that's my brief answer. I don't know if you want me to answer the question on Iran and get it over with so that you don't have to come back to me again.
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
In 2003, Iraqis were so drained and desperate under the rule of Saddam Hussein that some of them, or many of them, believed the claims of the United States as to their well-being and saving them from dictatorship. But everything I said today, which is a drop in the ocean, shows you, I was hoping, it shows you that one should never have these hopes and should never make these claims. The first Iranian-based militia that was allowed to enter Iraq in the first few weeks of the invasion was the Badr militia. 30,000 armed men were allowed to come into Iraq, and they proceeded to carry out a campaign of assassinations and terror against Iraqis. So sadly now, so many Iraqis, young Iraqis, are so drained, understandably so, and feel so oppressed by the horror perpetrated by the militias that are supported by Iran, that they are once again forgetting what the United States does abroad and what it stands for. One of the activists from the Iraqi uprising used the term takhadum. I mean, Iraq is one of the arenas where the United States and Iran are playing this game of chess. Takhadum, it's mutual service at the end of the day. In the first weeks of the uprising in Iraq 2 years ago, some of the slogans of this new uprising, which was really an amazing event, there were banners on the tall building, the Turkish restaurant in Tahrir Square. And one of the first slogans was, neither Iran nor the United States. I know this is too idealistic, but to be rational and reasonable, one Iraqis should never ever bank on the United States ever saving them from Iran. That is not what it's going to do.
Thank you, Sinan. I'm going to go out of order again, and then I'm going to direct the question from Dahlia to Deepa. To what extent did Trump rely on war on terror narratives and techniques to enable anti-immigrant policies, especially the so-called Muslim travel ban?
So the way I've written about this is to say that the Trump administration was, without a doubt, the most Islamophobic, administration in U.S. history, right? That is, what Trump did is he elevated the Islamophobic network. This is a group, a sort of coalition of various right-wing forces that include sections of the neoconservative political class. It includes Zionists, it includes evangelicals and the Christian right. It includes a group of people who call themselves ex-Muslims, who play the sort of authenticating role, native informants, if you will. And what Trump did is this Islamophobic network, which has been researched and written about by others, what he did is he elevated their conspiracy theories, right? He elevated, it's not surprising that QAnon becomes as famous as it does at the moment that Trump, who comes to attention and is able to build a campaign in support of him based on conspiracy theories of birtherism, whether Obama was born in the US or whatnot, that whole line of thinking, right-wing, rabid racism, that's what he amplified. These forces have existed for decades before Trump came to power, but he was able to channel and legitimate that. But these forces don't exist in some sort of vacuum, separated from the Obamas, from the liberal Islamophobia, from the liberal, racism and so forth. They really complement one another, and they dialectically interact with one another, which is why I've called them the new McCarthyites, right? Their role is to shift the rhetoric and to shift the policy. But the fact is, McCarthy was not alone. McCarthy was part of a system that actually created the Red Scare, or in this case, the Green Scare, or whatever you want to call it. So everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Oh my God, thank God he lost the election, and thank God Biden has come to power, and so on. And what did Biden do? He immediately went back to the kind of multicultural imperialism of the 1990s. Women, people of color, all in positions of power, serving as a way to project, the U.S. as this kind of exceptional state all over again, and papering over many of the atrocities that continue to be committed. So I'll just say one word on is another word possible, world possible, and pick up on a few points that Sinan made, which is I'm an optimist. I like to think I'm not Pollyannish, but I like to look at history as offering examples for how resistance can actually change the world. I mean, you mentioned the Tahrir Square, right? The so-called Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings that took place in the early 2010s, Tunisia, Egypt, and so forth, were a fantastic breakthrough moment, in my view, from the point of view of creating international solidarity, right? So you had these movements in squares in Spain, in different parts, in Egypt, in different parts of the world, all saluting one another through the logic of a movement that had been cut short after the events of 9/11. What do I mean? The global justice movement was up and away, questioning the regime of the 1%, neoliberal imperialism, right? 9/11 happens. We're getting ready to go to Washington. We think over 1 million people will be there. 10,000 protesters were there, right? So that was the kind of effect that 9/11 had on public discourse in this country. But the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings really shifted that around and created a sense of solidarity, at least among movement groups, and at least among people who recognize that this is an international system. I think that potential has always been there, right? The 1960s, the decolonial struggles, how people, built international solidarity and so forth. And if nothing else, the neoliberal system is one that forces people to come together across national lines to recognize just how horrible this system is to all of us. I mean, the fact that more people have died in the US because of the botched handling of COVID than that died in the Second World War should at least raise some consciousness among some people about whether this exceptional state actually gives a damn about its own people.
Thank you, Deepa. Next question is one that I'm particularly interested in. It's a great one from Terry. Thank you for the excellent session. The question is mostly for Professor Hajjar, but open to everyone. I'm wondering where you see the role of cultural production in challenging the secrecy around torture and US foreign policy. Does this resonate as an effective method or challenge to institutional silence? And the examples given are the report about the Senate report or the Mauritanian, and these cultural narratives highlight the dangers of that secrecy around torture, and they seem to designate a positive step towards a wider awareness and rejection of Black sites and CIA torture policies, even as they are often problematically patriotic. Would you see these narratives as setting out a record and demanding accountability, or are they a form of wishful thinking?
Oh, that is a great question. And I think, as someone who absolutely loves movies, I've seen every movie ever made, I don't think it's utopian to recognize the importance of cultural production. We can think of the negative effects. I mean, the fact that it was the first episode of this Fox drama that aired 24 that aired on November 1st, 2001. And it was already playing into the idea of we might need to torture the bad guys. And the impact that show had with Kiefer Sutherland was playing this vigilante who used torture in every episode. It was always the ticking bomb scenario. And it just it tapped into the kind of animus that was, rife and so intense after 9/11, but also the way that the narrative that, bad guys need to be tortured and it's good guys who torture bad guys to save good guys kind of a narrative. It had such an impact on, public perceptions that, military officers and human rights activists begged the producers of that show to stop misrepresenting torture as something useful and valuable, to no avail, because of course it was market pressures. But I do believe, the two films that Terry cites, the report, not the most, it's a little bit like paint drying, but it is an important story, most people, but what tiny infinitesimal number of people will actually even read the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence's report about the CIA torture program in its heavily redacted form. But many more people would watch the report and just understand at least that one slice of US history, and one that is really still unresolved. But I do want to just, commend the reference for the Mauritanian the film about Mohamedou Salahi, and it's, sort of about what the fights that go on over torture and incommunicado detention at Guantanamo. And, if I'm going to be optimistic, I would say that hopefully there will be much more cultural production of that sort that really does a brilliant job showing audiences a world that is still shrouded in secrecy and wrapped up in lies and denialism. So I'm all for more movies, and as soon as I finish the next 2 books I have to do, I want to write for Hollywood.
Darryl, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to jump in here a bit. This is more of a question than a comment, which is the opposite of what people normally do. For folks who work on film and things like that, I'm really curious. It feels like, I wasn't around then, but it feels like Vietnam produced a lot more interesting anti-war cinema and anti-war television than the past 20 years have. And I'm kind of curious about, why that. One can imagine all sorts of variables that might play into that. But even honestly, the first Rambo movie is a better anti-war movie, I think, than anything I've seen, in the 9/11 era. And part of it, I think, Lisa, I might disagree with you a little bit about the Mauritanian. I think the Mauritanian is the best of the torture movies, but I think it still sucks. And I think the problem with these movies is that they're made for white people, right? Like the entire structure of the Mauritanian, okay, the scenes with Tahar Rahim are great, and he's a brilliant actor. But the narrative structure of the film, just like the narrative structure of the report, is built around leading the viewer into the climactic revelation that torture happened, which to me just feels like a very politically and aesthetically, debilitating choice, because the audience that you're imagining that you're speaking to that is going to be stirred into action through this revelation, I don't think that's how it actually works, because people are going to watch it knowing that torture already happened. That's why they're watching the movie. So it's already kind of anticlimactic. And then also the representational choices involved, I think, are pretty disaffecting, if not alienating, for other potential audiences, right? Like Muslims, people of color, working class people, et cetera, et cetera. So, I have a, I'm just sort of all the rendition movie, all of these, it's I don't understand, just from a market standpoint, who the audience is and how they think they can make money, let alone make, an aesthetically or politically interesting film out of this stuff.
Could I just jump back in for
Please.
a second? So, Darryl, I agree with you about the, sort of the question of the anti-war nature of some of the Vietnam movies as contrasted to the post 9/11 war on terror related movies. One major difference that I think lent itself to these really searing films about Afghanistan was that, conscription, the military was composed of conscripted soldiers. Now it's a volunteer army. So that's one, I think, major factor. The other thing I would say specifically about the Mauritanian is that if you're looking specifically at torture, it was lawyers who fought as lawyers who brought this thing to an end. And so I think one film that kind of commemorates and recognizes those kind of battles is significant. It's not the only thing. And I'm so happy that Mohamedou Salahi has gotten so many opportunities to tell his story in other kinds of venues and so on. But I do think that that story about the role that lawyers played, Nancy Hollander is played by Jodie Foster. That's an important story to be told about this particular piece of the war on terror.
Sinan?
Yeah, I just want to say a few things to add, just that I think the post 9/11 cultural arena, I think, witnessed more of a complicity between Hollywood and Washington, D.C. Right after the Iraq war, several heads of Hollywood studios requested an audience with the White House to offer how they can help with the war effort. I don't know enough about the Vietnam era, but I don't think that has happened before. And I think we've reached a level, because of so many things, of identification with soldiers. It is such a militarized society that people identify with soldiers. That's another effect of all of these wars, is that, and you can see it in American fiction, in the fiction of most veterans is that the veterans are the actual victims of the war, and the civilians, whether Iraqis or Afghanis, have disappeared. Whenever there is a withdrawal, there are op-eds by soldiers saying, oh, our blood went for naught, as if they are the primary victims. And I think one of many examples is that The Hurt Locker, which is a pro-war movie, was celebrated as an anti-war movie. I mean, this is the gap that we're dealing with. A film whose narrative actually is identical to the Pentagon's narrative about, and the liberal elites' narrative about somehow we, quote unquote, ended up in Iraq and we're trapped there. No history, and every single Iraqi at the end of the film even the little kid is a terrorist. And with the other films like The Mauritanian, I think it ends up, there is a whole genre where American law is redeemed, no matter what, the law, right, the Constitution ultimately is going to save the day. So it ends up making audiences feel, despite everything, they leave feeling good about America. Because eventually, retroactively, we have access to the truth and to the records. And they go home and they feel good about themselves. And then we move on to the next atrocity and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Deepa.
Yeah, so this is technically my academic area of expertise. I'm a media studies scholar, but for better or worse, I don't stay within that box. So I do have a few thoughts about films. I mean, I think to add to what was said about why there were anti-war films made in the Vietnamese context and the Vietnam, or the American War as it was called, as opposed to the War on Terror, a huge part of this is the anti-war movement, right? Whether it was soldiers rebelling and resisting, right? The Soldiers' Rebellion, whether it was, the movement at campuses and so forth. This was a huge and massive movement that actually shifted the positions that would be taken by people in positions of power. That shift happens in '68 as a product of not just the defeat, the Tet Offensive, which tells the lie that the US cannot win the longer it stays there, right? But also because the anti-war movement reaches its high point. The conclusion that's drawn by sections of the political elite after this, and thanks to the cultural production and all the rest of it, is the media have to be controlled, and they have to be controlled much more thoroughly than they were, because the narrative is, the media, the news media and cultural products is what cost us the war in Vietnam. Never mind that was not the case, right? And so you start to see systems of propaganda and control being brought into being from the 1980s on, reaching the high point in the 1991 Gulf War, right, where people were chaperoned and made to tell the news story that they wanted to be told. But to come back to Rambo, now my reading of Rambo is slightly different, which is that it's anti-war to the extent that there is a criticism of the elite, right? And Rambo is the sole kind of voice who goes off and does the right thing in his own terms. But the way that, media studies scholars have read this was really a revival of a sort of hyper-masculinity, right? Which is that if you had white guys like Rambo who could just go out there and be themselves and not be the quote-unquote sissy men who gave up in Vietnam, that's the kind of robust, muscular internationalism that Reagan could actually personify through his war on terror and so forth. And so I feel like it's in that vein that I would like to read the Rambo films, all three of them actually. Lastly, I think you can't talk about torture without mentioning Zero Dark 30, right? What a horrific, horrific film, Jesus Christ. I went to see it in Midtown Manhattan in the theater district, not because I wanted to see it, but because I was writing a review of it. And the jingoism, this is New York City. This is multicultural New York City. The jingoism was out of control, right? The moments at which the US is killing people, including Osama bin Laden, cheers go up. USA, USA. And I'm like, oh my God, am I even safe sitting in this theater, right? So absolutely, cultural production of the sort completely ties into what a society is doing at a certain point in time, and sort of strengthens and reinforces that. So last thing is, if there were the anti-war movement, unfortunately died. There were huge protests against the war in Iraq, the proposed war on Iraq, right? It was the single largest protest in human history across the world. And yet, once the US actually went in, I was part of an anti-war coalition. The argument was, well, now that the US is there, they might as well nation build, right? Fundamentally racist ideas about a backward Iraq that the US should actually be building. So that movement died, as a result of which I'm not surprised that there weren't more films that were critical. And I'd recommend Evelyn Sultani's book, where she does a great job of analyzing both the complex as well as the simplistic films that were produced and television shows that were produced after 9/11.
Thank you, Deepa. I'd like to apologize to Sophia, who asked a question. I'm going to pose it to the panelists because they have about 60 seconds for any last words, 60 seconds each for any last words that they'd like to offer. And if they want to address the question of the spillover of the war on terror from into Syria. Before I give everyone the 60 seconds, I want to thank the panelists. This was really wonderful. Thank you to the audience. And a quick reminder that the recording of this will be available on the Security and Context website very soon, and even sooner on the YouTube channel. So maybe we could end the way we started and start with Lisa, and then Darryl, Sinan, and Deepa.
Well, thank you, Sophia, for the question. I think that Sinan really, touched upon the issue is that some of the violence that takes place, some of it that takes place in Syria was definitely spillovers from the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, and certainly the organization ISIS, was seated in U.S. detention facilities in Iraq in the during the period when the U.S. and NATO forces were trying to put down the so-called insurgency. So I think that Syria cannot be dissociated from the Iraq War and other kinds of things. Just on just as a final note, I would say it's really thank you for those who've attended, and I hopefully will be doing more of these kinds of events throughout the coming months in order to really continue reflecting deep and hard on these issues. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Darryl has kindly ceded his 60 seconds to me, which I'm not going to take. I'll split that with Sinan and Deepa if they, so you have 90 seconds, unless Darryl does want to jump later on.
Well, also, I'd really love to hear from Omar on this.
I think he is lurking in the background.
Oh, never mind. Sorry.
Speaking of the backgrounds, I'd be remiss not to thank everyone at Security in Context and at the Orfalea Center for all the support putting this together on the back end. Sinan, you have 60 seconds.
Well, I want to thank everyone too. I just want to say that I posted a link about the this award-winning poet Brian Turner from The Hurt Locker. The film is based on the title of one of his poems, but to show that just as we had embedded journalism, we have embedded culture as well in the war, and an embedded scholarship, and that's what the category that we should really scrutinize and think of as we go forward.
Yeah, so I'll try to end on an optimistic note, which is that I think that panels like this, meetings like this, everyone has other things I'm sure that they'd rather be doing. But if we can draw a page from the anti-Vietnam War movement, it started with educating ourselves about, so many important issues. And so I'll just say that the questions were great. The presentations were wonderful. The Q&A and dialogue was just fantastic. And we need more of this. And I think all of us, if I may speak for all of us, write not just, to advance, certain arguments that are academically useful or what have you. We write to change the world, whether that's poetry or that's, scholarship or what have you. And I do hope that this panel was useful for those who came to it to actually engage with these, what you learned here in conversations with others who may not have been here. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone at Security in Context and the Orfalea Center. Thank you to all the participants. This was really wonderful. Give it a few hours. It'll be up on the homepage of Security in Context and on the YouTube channel, so you can share this. Hopefully, I'm optimistic that this is the first of many events that explore the many legacies of the global war on terror. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you soon.